Welcome to this lecture from the Department of Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic at the University of Cambridge. My name is Elizabeth Rowe, and I am reader in Scandinavian history. When thinking about epidemics in medieval Iceland, historians focus on two things. First, in many ways, the Icelanders were healthier than people elsewhere in medieval Europe. This is partly because they lived on farms rather than crowded into towns, partly because they had ample access to fresh spring water rather than having to rely on wells that were easily contaminated, and partly because they had ample access to hot geothermal water and could wash their clothes and enjoy hot baths. Second, the Icelanders escaped the Black Death, the epidemic of bubonic plague that swept across Europe in the middle of the 13th century, killing as much as 1/3 of the population and up to half the population in some areas. Nonetheless, the Icelanders suffered many epidemics of other diseases. Some of these came from Norway, whose ships regularly visited Iceland, and others arose within the country. Modern epidemics such as COVID-19, SARS, and H1N1 bird flu jumped from animals to humans, and the medieval Icelanders lived in close contact with their livestock, especially the dairy cows that had to be sheltered in barns and byres over the long winters. Our information about epidemics in medieval Iceland comes from Annals, which are chronicles that are organized year by year. The Icelanders had learned to read and write and make manuscripts when they converted to Christianity in the year 1000. Around 150 years after that, they started taking notes of major events. Around the year 1200, they started to record current events in this year-by-year format, and the last year that the Annals cover is 1430. 12 annals survive today. They were compiled in different parts of the country for a range of patrons, including bishops, abbots, nuns, government administrators, and wealthy landowners. Taken together, here is their chronology of epidemics. 1152, Winter of Sickness. 1181, Winter of Sickness. 1192, Winter of Sickness. 1196, Winter of Loss of Life. 1240, Smallpox. Then erysipelas came out to Iceland. 1246, Winter of Sickness. 1258. Here it tells about the great loss of life that occurred in Miðfjörður, which took place on the later Feast of Mary. It led up after Easter week, and 150 people died of sickness in these parishes. 1268, Riska sickness in Iceland. 1284, Great sickness. 1291, smallpox in Iceland. 1301, loss of life in the north of Iceland before and after Christmas, and not fewer than 50 people died. 1306, great sickness in Iceland and great loss of life in the south of Iceland. 1308, widespread sickness in the north of Iceland. 1309, the great epidemic in the north of Iceland. 1310, there were 4 sicknesses at once in the West Fjords: throat sickness, chest pain sickness, smallpox, and pains in the eyes. Great loss of life. 1333, a great epidemic around the West Fjords. 1347, smallpox spread across the entire country and a multitude of people died. 1348, Winter of smallpox, great loss of life. 1360, loss of life around Mývatn. 85 people died in 2 parishes. 1376, winter severe and loss of life across the West Fjords, death of 5 priests and the death of Master Snorri. 1380, 6 ships came to Iceland and smallpox was in them, and the disease went all across Iceland, and there was great loss of life. 12 priests passed away in the south, and some priests passed away in the north. 1381, a great sickness spread all across Iceland. The priest Thorleif Bergþórsson died, as did Eric Magnusson the Mighty, Hákon Gizurarson, and Brynjolf Bjarnason the Mighty. 1382, sickness across the entire country and very great loss of life. 1389, a strange sickness all across Iceland, so virulent that scarcely any farm found itself not needing help, and yet not many people died from it. 1390, great loss of life on Snæfellsnes and likewise in many places. 1402, Einar Herjolfsson came out to Iceland with that ship that he himself owned. Such a great plague came out there in that ship that people lay dead within 3 nights. 1403, the year of great mortality in Iceland. 1304, the second winter of mortality. 1420, this winter a great sickness went across all the districts. 1426, a terrible winter for skin disease. Other strange sicknesses followed, first eye pains, then kidney pains. Curiously, the Icelanders suffered from more diseases than they had names for. The only diseases with names were smallpox, which they called bolnasot, the disease of swellings, erysipelas, which they called farkonasot, and that means beggar woman sickness. And also they had something called stingisot, so a sting is a stinging or a pain, and stingisot seems to have been anything that caused chest pain. And then there was a sickness that they called riska, and we just have no idea what that might have been. Otherwise, the chroniclers describe the symptoms. They talk about throat sickness, tongue disease, eye pains, kidney pains, or they just wrote sickness or loss of life. There also seems to have been one outbreak of zombie plague, and so here's an annal entry that seems to draw on a couple of different sources, because for the year 1192, we hear about great loss of life, but then at the end of this particular notice, the scribe seems to be drawing on an additional source because there's more information about what must have been the same loss of life that's referred to at the beginning of the notice. So at the end, this other source says, in the North Quarter, 2,000 people died of sickness and hunger between the beginning of winter and the end of May. But then in the middle, we get this very strange anecdote. A ship came into Breiðafjörður fastened almost completely with wooden nails. It was bound together with rope, and they had been at Krossey and Finnsbúðir for 7 winters, and they were with Gethler Thorsteinsson for the winter, and then there's an illegible bit, and they died there. So now they're in Iceland. So they died there and were buried east of the church. Then they turned into terrifying undead. Where they could, the chroniclers provide the same information about their epidemics that the authorities provide today. What is the disease? Where does it strike? How many people have died? How old were they? What were the symptoms? So, for example, the Skálholt Annals say, the 4th smallpox epidemic all across the country, so great that no one was so old that they could remember the like. It was so reckoned that nearly 400 people died in it between Kvitskegskvammur and Botsauer, and likewise around Flói and Ulfoss in the same way. The sickness struck in the south of Iceland this year and the next year in the north. It spread through the district so thoroughly that it took nearly every person younger than 40 and many older, and there were boils as well on those children where the mother gave birth at her death. We also have this from towards the end of the 14th century. Einar Hafliðason says, the strange sickness all across Iceland so virulent that scarcely any farm found itself not needing help, and yet not many people died from it. And then the new annals, the so-called new annals, say for 1420, this year a great sickness went across all the districts. Mostly those people died who were 60 years of age, a few were older. Significantly, the chronicles also often record epidemics occurring alongside other disasters. So, for example, in 1240, we have the first smallpox, but we also have great earthquakes in the south of Iceland. Bishop Nicholas of Greenland died. Then erysipelas came out to Iceland. Einar Thorvaldsson died, as did Arnbjörn Jonsson and Thorleik Ketilsson. In 1284, we hear about great sickness, but we also hear about loss of livestock, and many people died of hunger, and many farms were abandoned. In 1291, we hear about smallpox in Iceland, and we also hear that church properties were given to priests in the diocese of Skálholt. So Skálholt is the seat of the bishop of the southern half of Iceland. And then another scribe adds great glacial winter and winter of livestock deaths. In 1301, we hear about the loss of life in the north of Iceland before and after Christmas, and we hear that not fewer than 500 people died. But we also hear that there was a mudslide in Dyrfjörður and 6 people perished there. In 1308, we hear about an earthquake in the south of Iceland so great that the earth ripped open in many places and buildings on many farms fell over, and also widespread sickness in the north. 1310, smallpox in Iceland and a tongue disease, but also snow at Easter. 1376, winter severe and loss of life across the West Fjords, death of 5 priests and Master Snorri. 1379, 6 ships came to Iceland and smallpox was in them, and the disease went all across Iceland, and there was a great loss of life. 12 priests passed away in the south and some in the north, so that's information you've seen before. But then that's followed by, then storms and heavy snowfalls struck 5 weeks after Easter. It was a severe winter. The ship that the landowner Olaf Thorsteinsson and many other people were on was lost at sea. And then another scribe adds to that, King Haakon dead. 1389. Eruption of lava at Mount Hekla with such great wonders that one heard the din and crash all across the country. It destroyed 2 farms, Skarð and Tjaldastaðir. A strange sickness all across Iceland, so virulent that scarcely any farm found itself not needing help, and yet not many people died from it. 1390. Hard winter, rainy summer, so that people's haystacks were ruined. There was no bishop and no episcopal ombudsman in the diocese of Skálholt, and regular Christian life was little practiced there. Many priests died, and a multitude were driven away from the country, and most of those who were left had no benefit. Abbot Guðmund of Helgafell died. Great loss of life on Snæfellsnes, and likewise in many places. Spring so hard due to cold and snow that there was hardly anything for the sheep to eat by the feast of St. Peter in the summer. And then lastly here we have 1426, a terrible winter for skin disease. Other strange sicknesses followed, first eye pains, then kidney pains. And the scribe goes on to say, the genitals swelled up with severe pains. In addition, the sickness progressed thus that the throat and face swelled up, and then everything improved very quickly. Eruptions of the skin went over much of the body. Winter long and so hard in terms of weather that both horses and sheep died outside in the north of Iceland, and likewise widely in other places. It is the nature of chronicles to record what is unusual or what disturbs ordinary life, so it's not surprising to see these notices that list one disaster after another. Some of these misfortunes obviously have nothing to do with each other, but it does seem likely that there was a relationship between morbidity, mortality, famine, and long hard winters. Like modern reporting on epidemics, the style is generally factual and impersonal, but sometimes it seems important to commemorate the victims as individuals whose lives had value and who are mourned. For example, whereas other chroniclers report about the epidemic of 1309, the great epidemic in the north of Iceland, and great sickness and loss of life in the north of Iceland, sickness and some loss of life began in the south of Iceland and became an epidemic in the north. One clerical chronicler who lived in northern Iceland gives us this instead. Abbot Huskuld of Þingeyrar died, as did many priests in Iceland, such as Master Gamli at Huskuldstaðir, who was an excellent preacher and lived a virtuous life. The disease picked out the good farmers from the priests and laymen. It was called the deadliest spring. Several epidemics lasted for more than a year. A detailed description of one of these is found in the so-called New Annals. Einar Herjolfsson came out to Iceland with that ship that he himself owned. Such a great plague came out there in that ship that people lay dead within 3 nights. In response, 3 praise masses with suitable holding of prayers and lighting of candles were promised. Also, a dry fast was promised before Candlemas and a water fast before Christmas, forever. Afterwards, most received confession before they expired. During the autumn, the sickness spread in the south of Iceland with such great dreadfulness that it devastated farms far and wide, and far and wide the people that survived were not self-sufficient. Master Auli Svartovsson died in the autumn, the first of the clerics to die in this epidemic, and then Brother Grimm, the church priest at Skalholt. Afterwards, the resident priests died one after another. Master Huskold, the estate manager, on Christmas Day itself. Then at once it devastated the Skalholt estate, so that clerics and laymen died except for the bishop himself and 2 laymen. Then in the following year, we have more. The year of great mortality in Iceland. Death of Abbot Paul of Viðey and Lord Thorstein from Helgafell. Death of Lord Runolf of Þykkvabæjar and 6 monks, and another 6 survived. Death of Abbess Halldór of Kirkjubæjar and 7 nuns, and 6 survived. The Lady Abbess Gudrun Halldór's daughter was consecrated. 3 times the epidemic swept away the servants of the estate, so that at times the nuns milked the cows, those nuns that were there, and they knew nearly nothing about it, as was seen. They had never done such work before. 785 corpses came there to the church, so it was counted. But so many died afterwards that no reckoning was made afterwards due to the great number of victims. Also, the same year, it 3 times swept away the menfolk of the estate at Þykkvabæjar, so that no one was left except for 2 monks and one of the estate's house servants who was at home at the time this happened, and he brought food for them and those who came there. Death of Lord Abbot Thorstein of Helgafell and Gisli Svartsson from Reykhólar, Jon Guttormsson of Kvammar, and Thorður, who lives at the foot of Gnupr, and Paul Thorvarðarson from Eðar in the east, and his wife Cecilia, Thorstein's daughter. So what we're hearing about then is the plague arrives in a ship in 1402. It came to the harbor of Hvalfjörður in the southwestern part of Iceland. By Christmas, the plague had reached the bishop's seat at Skalholt in central southern Iceland. And here we can also get useful information from 2 documents that are not part of the Chronicles. And these are documents containing vows of atonement in hopes of protection from the approaching plague. And these documents come from northern Iceland. One was written on Christmas Day in 1402, and it shows that the epidemic had reached Skagafjörður in northern central Iceland before Christmas. The following year, 1403, is called the Year of Great Mortality, and the Annals mention by name some of the people who died, presumably from the plague, both in the far west and the far east of Iceland. The Annals call 1404 the second winter of mortality and relate that the plague returned to Skalholt. The plague receded after Easter. The detail that the plague is starting in the autumn must mean that the ship arrived in September 1402 or later, and together with the information for 1404 that the epidemic led up after Easter. So all this means that the epidemic raged in Iceland for about 19 months. As well as focusing on the toll taken on the ecclesiastical community of bishoprics, monasteries, and nunneries, these texts also record the religious response to the epidemic. Without a medical cure for the disease, the Icelanders placed their hopes in prayer and penitence. Special masses were held, and the Icelanders vowed to fast twice a year forever if only God would stop the epidemic. There must have been similar responses to earlier epidemics in Iceland, but the annals do not record them. Enough information is provided about this epidemic that researchers can guess that it was pneumonic plague. Unlike bubonic plague, which is spread by black rats carrying parasitic fleas, pneumonic plague can spread directly from person to person. This explains the disease in Iceland. It killed some 50 to 60% of the population, making it as virulent as bubonic plague, but it could not have been bubonic plague because black rats and their fleas live in warm climates and cannot survive Iceland's long, cold winters. We know that the epidemic continued through the winter because the second document recording vows of penitence was written on the 16th of January 1403 in Munkaþverá in Eyjafjörður, so that's central northern Iceland. And it says that people promised acts of atonement against the terrible mortality which then raged stronger than ever before. A minimum temperature of 10 degrees Celsius is a condition for any spread of bubonic plague, but typically the average temperature in January in inland localities in northern Iceland would hardly have been above -3 degrees. Moreover, whereas bubonic plague normally traveled at the speed of no more than 1 kilometer a day in the Middle Ages, the plague in Iceland traveled approximately 300 kilometers in around 16 weeks, so that's a speed of at least 3 kilometers a day. To conclude, the medieval annals of Iceland are considered to be fairly reliable evidence of the country's epidemiological history. One incorrect piece of information is the 785 corpses and uncounted others brought to the nunnery at Kirkjubæjar. There could not possibly have been so many people in the neighboring parishes, and the number is probably a misread Roman numeral. At a time when there was no cure for diseases such as smallpox and pneumonic plague, and no knowledge of what caused these epidemics, the annals reveal in plain language the vulnerability of the Icelanders to repeated epidemics of different diseases. The Icelanders relied on ships to bring essential items. For example, grapes and wheat do not grow in Iceland, so the Icelanders could not practice Christianity without imported wine and wafers. And so this meant that there was always the risk of infected individuals arriving along with the cargoes. And even though the Icelanders lived on farms and not in towns or villages, that very isolation meant that they prized human contact, leading to community spread of disease. The Icelandic sense of humor has always been dry and understated, and even in the midst of describing a terrifyingly virulent epidemic, the compiler of the new annals pokes fun at the aristocratic ladies of the nunnery of Kirkjubæjar, suddenly deprived of their dairymaids. 3 times the epidemic swept away the servants of the estate, so that at times the nuns milked the cows, and one could see they knew nearly nothing about it, as they had never had such work before. But this is the exception, and the chroniclers generally repress their feelings about the suffering and death. They do not try to find reasons. Epidemics are not caused by the sinfulness of the people. They're not caused by the black magic of witches. Epidemics are not heralded by ominous eclipses or comets. The chroniclers let the facts speak for themselves, and their silence about themselves, the chroniclers, this silence is more poignant than words. A particular example is found in the so-called oldest annals, and the title is traditional, but it's not correct. And these annals were compiled by a series of scribes in some clerical establishment in western Iceland. The second scribe writes down for 1306, great sickness in Iceland and great loss of life in the south of Iceland. This is the last notice in his handwriting, and then the third scribe takes over. We have to wonder, did the second chronicler die? Then a few years later, the third scribe writes down for 1309, fire at the church of Skalholt, the great epidemic in the north of Iceland. This is the last notice in his handwriting, and then the fourth scribe takes over. We have to wonder, did the third scribe die as well? The next year, the fourth scribe writes down for 1310, epidemic and loss of life all across the West Fjords quarter and the South quarter, and smallpox so severe that some people rotted apart. This is the last notice in his handwriting and the last notice in these annals. Did the fourth scribe too lose his life? However it was, no one there took up the pen again. Thank you.